Hello, welcome to Economic Perspectives on Wildfire, Preparation, Property, and Health. My name is Sean Cash, and I'm an economist at Tufts University. I'm also a current board member of and the program chair for the Council on Food, Agricultural, and Resource Economics. It's CFAIRE's mission to translate high-level research and knowledge to a diverse audience that includes policymakers, elected officials, and federal administrators. When we demonstrate the value of the profession of these groups, the Council increases public appreciation for research, extension, outreach, and academic programs in agricultural and applied economics. Next slide, please. Today, CFAIRE is partnering with the Association of Environmental and Resource Economists, or AERE, to address the issue of wildfires within the United States and shed light on their potential impacts on property values and human health, as well as ways to reduce wildfire spread. We're really glad that you've taken the time to join us today. I will now hand the reins over to Karen Palmer, the President-elect of AERE, who will be introducing our panelists today and moderating the discussion. Go ahead, Karen.
Thanks, Sean. Now I'm going to talk about our panelists. First is Matt Wibbenmeyer, who's a fellow at Resources for the Future and actually one of my colleagues. His research focuses on economics and policy associated with forest and land management, and in particular on topics related to wildfire risk, land use, and outdoor recreation. Next slide, is Patty Champ. Patty's a research economist with the U.S. Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station in Fort Collins, Colorado. Her current wildfire research program focuses on the intersection of community wildfire education programs and wildland-urban interface homeowners' risk mitigating behaviors. She's a member of the wildfire research team. And our third speaker today is Eric Zhu. Eric is an assistant professor of economics at the University of Oregon and a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Eric studies the economics of pollution prevention and the consequences and regulation of pollution from emerging sources, including wildfires. Now I'm going to hand the webinar over to Matt Wibbenmeyer, who will start us off. Matt, take it away.
Okay, so thanks, Max, and thanks, Karen and Sean, and to CFAIRE and AERE for organizing and hosting this webinar. So I'm going to talk about costs of wildfire in the wildland-urban interface and who bears those costs. So as I'm sure all of you are aware, in the last several years, we've had a number of very severe wildfire seasons in the Western United States. This is actually part of a much longer running trend going back to the 1970s. So this is a figure from Leroy Westerling paper from 2016, which shows that the annual number of large forest fires in the Western US has risen by about 500% since 1970, and the annual area burned in large fires during that same period has increased by about 1,200%. Next slide, please. And so with that increase in wildfire activity has been also a dramatic increase in damages. So this is showing the 20 most destructive fires in California state history. And 15 of those 20 most destructive fires have been just in the last 6 years since 2015. Next slide, please. The area we're primarily concerned with when it comes to these fires is the wildland-urban interface, or WUI, and this is an area where low to moderate density residential development is adjacent to or intermingles with large areas of wildland vegetation, which potentially carry wildfire in the Western US. Next slide, please. The WUI has been growing over the past several decades. This is a figure from Volker Radloff and others from a couple years ago that shows that the total area of the wildland-urban interface, the number of housing units and the population living in the WUI has increased between 1990 and 2010. So there's been a 40% increase nationally in the number of homes in the WUI and about a 30% increase in the total area in the WUI. These are national numbers, but the growth of the WUI in the Western United States has been strong as well and is expected to continue to remain strong. So a paper by Michael Mann and co-authors from 2014 projected that California is expected to add 600,000 to 1.2 million homes in high wildfire risk areas by 2050. Next slide, please. So with this increase in development within the wildland-urban interface, there are some costs. So most obviously, there is a cost associated with wildfire damage due to increasing development in the WUI. If we look at fires in California between 1985 and 2013, as Kramer and co-authors did in this 2019 paper, about 80% of the homes that were lost in those fires were in wildland-urban interface areas. As well, in addition to just home losses, insurance costs are rising in these areas. Insurance is becoming harder to find. Also, there are increasing costs of managing wildfires due to increased WUI development. So costs of managing wildfires approximately doubled between 1994 and 2012, as the figure on the right shows. Costs of managing wildfires have reached $3 billion. That's by federal agencies, most importantly the Forest Service and DOI. And that also doesn't include pretty significant spending by state agencies, especially CAL FIRE. So a lot of this increase in wildfire management spending is just due to increases in wildfire activity. But there's also really strong evidence that shows that agencies spend more on wildfires when they start near homes. So as we have more homes in wildland-urban interface areas, that's also going to drive up costs for management agencies. Next slide, please. So all of this raises the question, who is bearing those costs and who is benefiting from increased wildfire suppression in these areas? So this is a question that RFF research analyst Molly Robertson and I have been looking at using data from Zillow Z-Tracks on property values. We've been using US Census data on demographics, as well as US Forest Service data on fire risk. This is a topic that has attracted some attention in the media, but I think there are competing conceptions about who on average is, which are the type of households that live in these high wildfire risk areas. And so I wanted to ask you, and I see that you've all had a chance to respond. So thank you for that. And now I'll show you what Molly and I have found in our analysis. Next slide, please. In line with what you all responded. So on average, areas with high wildfire risk have higher per capita income, they're whiter and older. If we look at property values in these areas, comparing high fire hazard areas to low fire hazard areas, in most states, on average, property values are higher in high wildfire hazard areas, though there's quite a bit of variation in these areas. Certainly not all homes in high fire hazard areas are high value. There's a lot of variation here as well. Next slide, please. Geographically, this map shows in yellow areas where high wildfire properties tend to be higher value, and in darker colors, areas where high fire hazard properties tend to be lower value. And what you can see is the high value areas are along the California coast or in urban areas such as the Colorado Front Range or Salt Lake City. In general, there's a larger area of the Western United States where high fire hazard areas tend to be lower value. But in the places where properties are higher value, there's greater density. And so this is how we get the result that on average, areas with high fire hazard are higher value than low fire hazard areas. Next slide, please. So a couple of concluding thoughts. WUI areas are expanding as wildfire hazard in these areas is growing. Not all costs of building in these areas are borne by households, especially costs of wildfire suppression and management. Households in high fire hazard areas are disproportionately wealthy, so many of these households could be choosing to live elsewhere. And finally, housing stock is durable. We're going to be living with homes built in high fire hazard areas for a very long time. So it's worth thinking through, is this risk we really want to take on? Next slide, please. So a final point, just to put this into a broader historical context. This is a figure from Marlin and co-authors from 2012, which shows biomass burned in the Western United States over the past 1,500 years, and that's in the red line. The purple line, the darker purple line, shows how much biomass we would expect to burn in a given year, given climate conditions in that year. And so what you can see here is that compared to the last 1,500 years, even though we've been seeing a rise in wildfire activity, we're still at a very low level of wildfire activity compared to what was typical in the Western United States over the last 1,500 years. And it's much lower than what we would expect given current climate conditions. So we're going to continue to see a large increase in wildfire activity in the Western United States. And there's a lot more wildfire activity. There's sort of a lot of room to grow in this wildfire activity. And so we really need to be considering this when we're thinking about how much risk we want to take on with newly developed areas. Next slide. So thank you. Now I'll pass it back to Karen.
Thanks, Matt. That was a great presentation. Next, we're going to be hearing from Patty Champ from the U.S. Forest Service.
Thank you. So thank you so much for inviting me today. It's a pleasure. And Matt did a fantastic job of greasing the skids for my presentation. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the wildfire research team. We call ourselves AERE. I want to tell you who we are and what we do and what are some of the outcomes of the work we do. So next slide, please. There was recently this article in Wildfire Today by Jack Cohn, and the title was Community Destruction During Extreme Events is a Home Ignition Problem. And I pulled out a quote from that article, and Jack makes the point that, you know, extreme wildfires are inevitable, and I think most folks would agree with that. But, you know, are these WUI disasters, are those inevitable as well? And Jack argues, no, they're not, because we have the science that tells us what can be done to mitigate that risk. Well, who's Jack and why should you listen to him? So Jack pioneered this concept along with some others, but it was really the core was Jack's work on the home ignition zone. So it's this idea that you harden your structure, and as you move away from the structure, you manage combustibles and vegetation so that you reduce the risk of losing your home to wildfire. So it provides very solid guidelines, and though work is continuing, we largely know what needs to be done. And it's not a guarantee, so it's like wearing a seatbelt or wearing a mask, but you're shifting the odds in your favor if you undertake these activities. So we have a very well identified goal, but we don't really see sufficient numbers of homeowners taking action, and we have to ask ourselves, why not? And how can we improve that situation? So I would argue that really the home destruction problem is a behavioral problem. So next slide, please. So this is a quote from one of the mitigation coordinators here in Colorado, just saying, you know, you can't make people do what's in their best interest. And we know this, we're all human, and those of us who have raised children, we really know this is true. So next slide, please. But research and practice show that while research and practice show that changing behavior isn't easy, in the context of wildfire, we see success when residents work with local, trusted wildfire education programs. So the AERE team has been working together. We've been working with each other for over 15 years, at this intersection of wildfire education programs and private landowners. So our goal is to support these local mitigation efforts by providing actionable evidence. And this evidence does three things. It provides information about all the residents in a community and avoids undue attention to the vocal few. The second thing that this kind of work can do is it can provide evidence to steer community discussions to real problems and move away from anecdotes that might be unfounded. And then the third thing our work can do is provide biophysical and social metrics that can be used to measure progress or lack of progress. So I know this slide is really busy, and the intent of it just is for you to, take a glance and see that we truly are a group of research and practitioners, that we work together and that we're co-productive. So next slide, please. So what is it that the AERE team does? First let me talk about the scale at which we work. We collect data at the same scale at which local programs are administered, at the community scale, where community is defined in this case by the local education program. Whatever their notion is of community, that's where we collect data. So the relevant social data that can really inform programs largely do not exist at this scale. And oftentimes it's argued that we should scale up. We should do work at, the county level or the state level. But we argue that there's benefits in scaling out. So we're looking at more communities across space and across time. So what do? We have this systematic data collection. So largely for most of our project, we have a core data that are the same, and then we have some data that are specific to the place in which we're working. So we start off with our partners collect the data, and they do a rapid parcel risk assessment of every parcel in a community. So it's a drive-by, it's quick, it should take about a minute. And they look at the different characteristics of a parcel. Usually there's about 10 or 11, it varies from place to place. And the characteristics are the things you might think they would look at. What's the vegetation on the property? Are there combustibles near the home? What's the structure made of? And from that, then they weight these attributes and they come up with an overall risk rating oftentimes from low to extreme. That too can vary. And then we pair on top of that a household survey. So the household survey goes out to every structure that's been assessed. Again, it's not a sample, it's a census of the community. And because these data are collected by our partners, who are often really well trusted in the communities, we get very high response rates. We often get about 50%. We have a partner now who's telling us we're going to get 80%, a community in Utah, we'll see. But we have these data. So in the household survey, we ask residents about those same characteristics that the professionals are looking at to see what the residents' perspective is on their parcel. And then we also ask about many other things. We ask about what are your barriers to mitigation? How do you get information? How would you like to get information? What's your experience? What are your attitudes, etc. So then we can do, with these data, we can make comparisons of different places or the same place over time. And then we've also built a master data set. So we're building it from the ground up, and we have, I don't even know how many observations we have now, but a lot, and many communities across different places in the West. And then the final characteristic of these data is that they are geo-referenced. So that allows us to link these data to other kinds of risk assessments. Next slide, please. So this just shows where we're working, and you can see we're working in the Western United States. Of course, our approach would work in other places, but because we started out with work in Colorado, we've kind of stayed in the West. And I just included this little graphic here. This was an example from a project we did in North Central Washington State. And in this case, you can just see there were 4 communities, and this was the situation where you expect the least heterogeneous communities because they're all right next to each other. They're under the same jurisdiction. And you see, even in this best case scenario place, there are big differences across these communities. So that's just to make our point about local context and community matters. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the professional looks at the parcel, and then we ask residents about that as well. So this little graphic is actually from a project we just finished in Colorado in Chaffee County, which for those of you who know Colorado or who visit Colorado, it's a community in the Collegiate Peaks. So what you see is that we often see this pattern. We don't always see this pattern, but that the professionals, when they looked at all the home parcels in this community, they rated 48% of them to be at very high or extreme risk. But when you compiled the survey responses of the residents in that community, most people thought their parcels were at moderate or low risk. And well, why is this important, you might ask? And it's important because community programs are administered from the perspective of the practitioner and how they see the parcels within a community. But residents make decisions about how they're going to mitigate their parcel based on their perspective of the community. So one goal of our research is to get these two perspectives on the same page. Next slide, please. So this is an infographic it's kind of dated now, but it's from this community where we did work called the Town and Mountain Village, and it's down by Telluride. Some of you might be familiar with that area. So prior to doing work in this community, the conversation was in the community that, you know, these folks, they don't care much about wildfire risk. They're not willing to cut trees. It's just hopeless. So we did a project there with West Region Wildfire Council. We collected these data. When these data and others were presented back to the community, what they realized was that actually most people said that they would be willing to cut trees. 77% said they're willing to cut trees, but the restrictive HOA rules are a barrier. In that case, they had to get a permit for every tree that they cut. This moved the conversation from this hopeless, people don't care and they don't want to cut trees, into something, you know, that could be targeted. Let's do something about those HOA rules. So it changed the conversation in this community, and it really identified a path forward that the town council and local businesses actually rallied around. Next slide, please. So this is an example of how the data can both target a program and how it can be used to measure change over time. So this infographic is from a community called Log Hill Mesa. It's outside of AERE, Colorado, or Ridgway, Colorado, for those of you familiar with that part of the world. And what we found was that in 2012, when these data were collected, that 35% of the folks who responded to the survey said that getting rid of slash was a barrier for them mitigating their parcels. And, you know, you're cutting trees, you're thinning vegetation, you're limiting things up, you're creating all this vegetation that you have to get rid of. So it's not so easy. So in this case, our partner, West Region Wildfire Council, wrote for grants, and they went into this community and they had more what are called chipper days. So someone, if you make piles, someone will come by, they'll chip up your debris and get rid of it for you. So they got grants, and then they also, just because of this kind of research practice model, they were encouraged to keep track of everything, things that folks don't, the granting agencies didn't ask them to keep track of how many homeowners participated or how many piles were chipped, but they kept track of that as well. And then you see in 2017, we revisited this community, so we did the whole WIRE approach again. And in this case, you can see that they tracked all the work they did, but also they really did reduce this barrier to mitigation in this community. So in 2017, 13% of the same respondents said that mitigation was, or that slash management was a barrier. Next slide, please. So thank you. That's my quick story about WIRE. Please contact me if you want to know more about our WIRE team, or if you're working on something that you think I should know about. Maybe you're working in a different space, but you're doing similar work. I'd love to hear about it. So just passing it off to Eric now. These burning homes also contribute to unhealthy smoke. Thank you.
Next up, we're going to hear from Eric. He's from the University of Oregon again. So Eric, why don't you take it away? Thanks.
All right, great. Thanks for having me. All right, so my talk is going to be more on the pollution and health side. So I want to first highlight my research team. So this is together with Nolan Miller and David Molitor, both at the University of Illinois. All right, next slide. Okay, so two things I want to get across quickly today. One is how do we estimate the causal effect of wildfire smoke exposure on elderly mortality, like health outcomes? How do you use remote sensing data to capture smoke plumes and combine air quality information and health records to see what happens on the ground, right? So the second thing is to think about where are people affected, right? So one unique thing about wildfires is that the smoke plumes can travel hundreds or even thousands of miles away from the originating fires. So local fire event can really have really like regional or national exposure to pollution. All right, so next slide. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about like what are we doing here, right? So here is a satellite image of the rim fire in California 2013. You can see the fire in the middle of the picture, the city of Reno, which gets a lot of smoke from the fire, in San Jose in California, which is almost like equally distant to the fire, but it doesn't seem to have a lot of smoke. So on the next slide, I'm going to show you what air quality looks like in those two cities, right? So you can see that the rim fire really elevated the pollution levels of PM 2.5 from about 10 microgram per cubic meters to above 60, right? So next slide. If you're unfamiliar with like what is 60 microgram per cubic meters, that's about the level of pollution you see in Beijing meanwhile, right? So RIM is really a kind of tail event, like a big event, but our research is going to look at the universe of all fires and smoke events ever happen. So next slide. So here is basically the main thing of our research. So we use smoke plumes like GIS data from NOAA, the Weather Bureau. So it turns out there were a group of satellite experts since 2005 who sit down every day, look at multiple satellites and manually draw the boundaries, all smoke observed across the US land. And here I am showing you a day-by-day snapshot of how RIM evolved into a major fire events, right? So it's easy for us to figure out like which counties on which days are covered by smoke and which days they are not. All right, next slide. So what we do then is link to two primary outcomes, right? So one is ambient air quality. So we use ground monitoring data from the United States Environmental Protection Agency. So for health outcome, we look at elderly mortality. We have data on Medicare enrollment directory. So for basically every people in the United States age 65 and plus, we know their resident zip code. And for decedents, we know the exact date of death, which is verified by the Social Security Administration. And this is we're going to use that data to construct our main outcome of elderly mortality. All right, so I guess we are ready to see some results. Next slide. Oh, okay, sorry. This is just showing you that you can do this measurement of which counties are covered by smoke or not very easily in statistical software. Let's skip to the next slide. Okay, so this figure shows you how smoke impacts air quality, right? So what I'm showing you is what happens to PM 2.5, fine particulate matter pollution, on the y-axis, as a function of days since smoke exposure, right? So what happens to air quality shortly before and after smoke hits a county? So day 0 on the x-axis is the day when the satellite sees smoke exposure, and you can see on that exact day, PM 2.5 jumps up by about 2.3 microgram per cubic meters, relative to the average about 10.7 to something like 20% increase. Now, we are interested not only in air quality, but also how does elderly mortality or health outcomes changes. So on next slide, I'm going to replace the y-axis with Medicare mortality rate, right? So what you can see again here is that the curve appears to be totally flat, except for a jump exactly on day 0. So in other words, mortality rate jumps up on the day when smoke hits the region. Okay, next slide. Okay, so that was basically the main idea of our health analysis, although there are tons of details in the paper. So the bottom line is we calculate that the wildfire smoke implies about 12,000 premature elderly deaths per year, right? Now, if you ask an economist, how would you or people at EPA would value such increase in the mortality risk? So what we're going to do is that we're going to assume a 3.5 live years lost per decedent among the Medicare population from previous research. And if you're willing to assume a value of statistical life of $100,000 per year life lost, you're going to come to this number that the cost of wildfire in terms of elderly mortality increase is about $4.2 billion per year. Right? So one thing I want to point out is that that number is on the same order of magnitude with respect to the $4.1 billion we spent in direct suppression, protection, and structural damage costs. Right? So we hope this type of analysis is going to provide some information on the calculus of the cost and benefit of fire suppression. All right, next slide. So now I'm going to sort of enter the second part of the talk, thinking about where are people affected. Again, smoke can travel hundreds or even thousands of miles away from source. So local event can have national impact. So I can't show the full analysis, but let me just illustrate this exercise among the largest fires in California's history. Right, so next slide. So we're going to use the Mendocino Complex fire as an example. This is one of the largest kind of fires in California's history. I think it's the largest by last year. This year might be different. So it burned on and on from July 27 to September 17, 2018. A total of about 500,000 acres burned. The suppression cost about $200 million. And very unfortunately, one firefighter died in this event. Right, next slide. So what we're going to do is that we're not going to focus on the counties that are on fire, but we're trying to think about where all the pollution goes, right? So this is, we use our satellite data to track how many days a county is covered by a smoke plume that's linked to the Mendocino County, right? So you can see the color scale here shows you how many days that a county is covered. Of course, in Northern California and Southern Oregon, there are tons of days, like over a month or so, people are covered in smoke. But one interesting thing I want to point out is that after a while, you can see that even in New York, right, in the East Coast, people spend about a week in smoke that originate from the Mendocino fire, right? So if you use that estimate, and if you sort of believe our mortality estimate, you're going to come down to this number that the smoke death of the Mendocino Complex fire is really not one firefighter, but about 592 premature elderly deaths. Next slide. So then what we do is we're going to ask the question, where does that 600 deaths occur, right? So this is a tabulation of those kind of 592 deaths by the county's distance to the fire, right? So basically what that shows is about 30 people, if you look at the first bar to the left, about 30 people dies within I think it's 50 miles to the fires, right? So you see the distribution is kind of bimodal. A lot of people die near the fires, but you also have a lot of people sort of, premature mortality occurs when you are like 2,000 miles away from the fire. Why is that true? Let's look at next slide. That is when the smoke hits the Midwest, right? So not a lot of people exposed to smoke, but a lot of people lives there. Okay, so next slide. So from this slide, I'm going to show you kind of the same analysis across different fires. So number one is the Mendocino Complex fires. On the left panel is the satellite picture of smoke. Middle panel is the smoke exposure footprint. And the right hand side is death by distance. This is the first. Let's look at the next slide. The second largest fire is Thomas Fire in California, 2017. Now, very luckily on that season, the wind is blowing from the land to the ocean, right? So you can see the smoke is going to the ocean. Not a lot of people die sort of because of pollution exposure. Next. You see that the same thing with rim fire, right? And if you look at the next slide, for the fourth largest fire, which is the Rush Fire, and if you go to the next slide, is the Zeka Fire, where you see sort of very similar kind of pattern going on, right? So a local fire event can really have far-reaching effect. And in terms of health impacts, we think that the way to think about it is not to focus just on the counties that are on fire. Next slide. Okay, so that's basically what I want to talk to you today. There are many other things I can tell you about this paper, so please feel free to reach out to me and our research team. Thank you.
Before we wrap up, we wanted to point out that CFAIR is online at cfair.org and encourage those who enjoyed this webinar to sign up for our newsletter, where you'll get more information on similar events. We're also on Twitter, and all of our programs are available on our YouTube channel. You can find it by searching for our name on YouTube. That's the Council on Food, Agricultural, and Resource Economics. Please follow us and subscribe. We also encourage and welcome any and all inquiries. Please contact us at information@cfair.org with your questions. Next slide, please. A quick word of thanks to our partners. This and other CFAIR programming wouldn't be possible without the continuing support of the Agricultural and Applied Economics Association, the U.S. Department of Agriculture's National Agricultural Statistical Service, as well as the Department's Economic Research Service, also support our activities. The Association of Environmental and Resource Economists played a crucial role in the organization of this event. Thank you for all the assistance that they provided. For more information on AERE, please visit AERE, that's AERE.org. Next slide, please. In addition to Karen Palmer from AERE, we want to make sure to thank all of our panelists, Matthew Wibbenmeyer, Patty Champ, and Eric Zhao, for their presentations on the economic issues related to wildfire. Lastly, we want to send a thank you to the audience. We're passionate about this subject, and we think you are too, but it's not a small thing to plan to give up a lunch hour to spend this with us. We want to ask you to do one more thing, and that's follow us on Twitter. We hope you enjoyed this event as much as we enjoyed hosting it. Take care.